The only thing that actually matters here is the use case. Are there going to be these use cases that actually leverage block space and actually give a shit about low latency and composability such that this is necessary? That's the most important question. The Firedancer thing is more like a future-proofing the system. If something like this were to happen, can the network actually handle it elastically going forward? Or will it just fucking totally break, which Solana has done in the past, such that this network is not viable for increased usage?
Listen, y'all, we are just a few days away from Permissionless 3 in Salt Lake City. It's Blockworks' yearly crypto conference, one of the best in the whole industry. And this is a can't-miss event if you're in the Solana world. There is a cracked lineup of Solana folks coming, and we'll be doing a live taping of Lightspeed, which is going to be super good. And I'd love to meet some of you Lightspeed listeners in person. So please, if you haven't registered yet, please consider attending. And we have a little gift for you. If you use the code Lightspeed10 at checkout, you'll get 10% off. That's Lightspeed10 for 10% off at checkout. I'd love to see some of you there. Now let's get into the episode. If you like the Lightspeed podcast, then you need to subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter, written by a team including yours truly and delivered to your email inbox daily. Lightspeed is your essential daily briefing on all things Solana. Exclusive news, deep analysis, and the latest trends delivered in a way that's digestible and, I think, sometimes kind of funny. Stay ahead of the curve with the same insights that guide readers from Brevin Howard, Gemini, Jito, CME Group, Solana Labs, and Foundation, and many more. The link to sign up can be found in today's show notes or if you go to blockworks.co. Subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter today. This episode is sponsored by Sei, the parallel execution EVM-compatible Layer 1 with sub-second finality. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. We'll hear more from Sei later in the show. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed, your go-to pod for all things Solana and crypto. I'm your host, Jack Kubanek, joined today by my co-host, Mert Mumtaz, for a roundup. Mert, how's it going, man?
Good, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. And you know, before we get into anything, I just wanted to recognize what is a huge career accomplishment for you, a big moment that happened this week. I was scrolling on the X feed, and I noticed that you, Mert, have become crypto's #1 KOL as measured by Kite AI. So big congrats. This is obviously what it's all about, and just want to recognize that live here on the pod.
Yep. My father will be immensely proud of me.
I've just always been curious to ask you this, but do you ever get just like super sick of Twitter, or do you actually like tweeting a ton?
I would say certainly I get sick of, or maybe not sick of, but impatient with very unnuanced takes on topics I understand. And I'm kind of just like reading what they're writing. Like they'll write about like Solana nodes or something, and I'll be like, I've been literally doing this for 3 years. Like, this is not correct in any way. I'm not sure why I have to now spend energy to rebuke this, but sometimes that happens, but you know, got to be done.
There's actually a lot to kind of go over this week with a lot of the announcements we saw at Breakpoint and so on. But I think I want to start just with, you know, the spicy stuff. So this week, Mert, Edward Snowden did the most controversial thing he's ever done, and he called Solana centralized. And you took issue with this, Mert. So, like, I guess my understanding of his critique is just kind of, he didn't really lay it out in a ton of detail, but he's one of the creators of Zcash, which is this kind of private money, like private crypto focused peer-to-peer cash thing. And he basically kept saying like Solana has levers that allow people to take from you. So like a nation state could censor you or things like that. You came on, and as you said, don't like unnuanced takes on Twitter. So you came on and we're tweeting back at him. Walk me through sort of your take on the Snowden centralization thing.
I listened to the little segment, and it wasn't actually just centralization. It was kind of like, yeah, basically they optimize for centralization, and then it's centralized and it's only good for scams and stuff like that. And One of the things about this centralization argument in crypto is that it's become very religious and a topic of ideology in a sense, but it's actually just an objective measure, right? This is not something that is up for subjective interpretation. The decentralization of a system is determined by the system, which is live and in production, right? It's an engineering system. It's like saying my Ferrari is slow. It's like, okay, you can just drive the car and see if it actually is slow, and you can see on the speedometer what speeds it can get up to, right? And then, of course, there's other aspects to the car that affect this. It's not just the engine. It's maybe the tires or the track conditions or even the legal conditions and where you're driving and all this, which is to say that it's a nuanced topic, but it's still objective. And so I think I said something pretty simple. I said, he seems to think that it's centralized without providing any data. I challenge anyone to show me the single attack vector that would cause a central point of failure. And I was pretty disappointed with the responses because I didn't actually get any data or any coherent arguments. The response I got were almost all ideological in nature, meaning something along the lines of, well, Solana has higher node requirements, right? Like it's harder for somebody to spin up a Solana node. And it's like, yeah, that's correct. It's very obvious that it's harder because the requirements are higher, as you can measure them by looking at the specs. That being said, the accessibility of node running is not the only thing that you can look at to determine if a network is centralized, right? You need to look at, first of all, how many nodes are live in production for that network, right? You can say they're theoretically high, and they are, but if there are 100,000 nodes, for example, on mainnet, and there aren't, but if there were, then that argument would hold no weight, right? Like you can kind of lay out your theory, but if it doesn't match up with evidence observed from reality, then it's a bad theory. And I did like a series of posts, and basically there is no single central point of failure on where you can, let's say, push Solana and just permanently break the system. The only real attacks that you could do would be, or central points of failure would have been a single client, right? There is one software that all the nodes run, and that's the Agave software. But that argument has gotten much weaker after, obviously, Jito went live, and Jito also does independent code reviews, and that's a second client. It's mostly similar to Agave, but the point here is that there are multiple engineering core dev teams that look at the core code. Same with Firedancer. Firedancer actually has already detected a bunch of bugs before they went into production or patched them. Frankendancer is also live on mainnet. And then Firedancer is live in non-voting mode on mainnet, meaning it still participates and does everything a node does. It just doesn't vote for consensus. And obviously there's SIG coming out, which is Syndica's new validator client. And there's also Mithril, which is a new home verification node client. And so that argument it doesn't seem very convincing to me. And then you might look at, let's say, the node count. And the node count is, after Bitcoin and Ethereum, is the second, or it's the highest, right? It's thousands of nodes. Some are subsidized by delegation program, but we already did the analysis on this and wrote up an entire research report on what would happen if it was pulled, how many validators are profitable without it. And even in that case, it's hundreds of nodes, I think upwards of like 600. So then you look at that, and then, then people will start saying things like, well, they're only in data centers, right? And that's correct. But the key aspect here is it's not in one data center. It's in actually hundreds of data centers around the world in different jurisdictions, different geographies, and different, let's say, governments as well. And so that is to say, the single point of failure here would be if somehow everyone on Earth coordinated to take down all the data centers that Solana operates out of. The probability of that is essentially zero, right? Like you would have to coordinate across all nations on Earth in a sense. But even if you were to do that, what would happen is you would cause a temporary liveness failure for the epoch, which would then be remedied in the next epoch. So this actually already happened. Hetzner, which was the biggest data center provider for Solana nodes back in the day, and roughly 20% of stake or something was running through it. They just said they were going to ban Ethereum nodes, but they also banned Solana nodes, and like a good amount of the stake went delinquent for a bit. But nothing happened to the network because you can just move those keys around. And so the crux of the argument is kind of this, or maybe there's two sides, but one is you can say that Solana is like less decentralized than Ethereum, which would be objectively correct, but that doesn't imply that it's inherently centralized on its own right, right? The analogy I give here is like Usain Bolt is faster than LeBron James. That does not mean LeBron James is slow, right? It's just a very weird fallacy and reasoning. And the second is like node requirements are one equation of what determines the holistic decentralization of a network, but they're not the only thing. What's much more important are the incentives to run the nodes for that network. So if it costs you $1 million, let's say, to run a node, but you make $5 million over the year from economic activity on the chain because the chain actually scales to fit more activity, that might be worthwhile. Versus if your node costs $5,000, but you're actually losing money, let's say $1,000 per year, then why would you run that node, right? Like it's the incentives that actually matter. Like I can run a Polkadot node right now. I'm not going to because I have no interest. I don't care about what happens there. I don't think it'll go up. I don't think there'll be economic activity. And so the people always mistake, perhaps on purpose on Twitter, the ideological basis for decentralization versus empirical decentralization. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
In what sense is Ethereum more decentralized than Solana? With that whole Usain Bolt and LeBron James anecdote.
Well, it has more clients that are actually live in production today, and I think the split between them is relatively even. It wasn't always, but it now is. It has more nodes in general, right? So, okay, why do you want lower hardware requirements? So that you can get more nodes. And so that's the purpose. And there are more nodes on Ethereum than Solana. I think something like 8,000 or something like that, versus Solana is like roughly around 1,500 in terms of validators. In terms of full nodes, it's actually like 4,000. But like this is where comparing across chains becomes weird because they don't have the same terminology. And so it is more decentralized. And then in terms of also like it's an older network, meaning that distribution has happened between stakeholders and early team members and all sorts of things over a longer time horizon already. So the stake concentration in terms of team and VCs and early insiders seems to be better, although you would have to check the numbers. I don't think it's all better though. Like for example, Coinbase holds roughly 12% of stake of Ethereum. That's 12% of the network. On Solana, the biggest validator, which is like Helios and Galaxy, are 3%. And then if you actually add up all the centralized exchanges on Ethereum, it actually amounts to something like over 25%. Whereas on Solana, it's not close to that. There are also other considerations like delegation, right? Solana has delegation for stake built into the protocol, meaning you don't need centralized exchanges like Coinbase to take care of it for you. And you don't need Lido. In fact, Lido tried coming on Solana and they left because they couldn't find PMF because it already exists in the protocol itself. There are also other considerations, right? Like you need to put up the 32 ETH to actually start up the validator up front. Versus on Solana, you just need to cover the voting costs, which is roughly 1 SOL per day. That being said, Ethereum is more decentralized. Also on a social layer, I would say it's more decentralized. Like there's just more people. There's more ecosystems and more ecosystems doing different things. Versus Solana is a bit more cohesive. So yeah.
Yeah, that's always the interesting angle of decentralization to look at is sort of the social decentralization, or like almost small p political, like, and you and I have spoken about this before, but the sense that, the Nakamoto coefficient is whatever number it is, but like realistically, you would need people to be colluding with one another. And so if everyone is like informally very friendly with each other and can work together, that's like a decentralization vector you can't really measure. It's more vibes based, I guess. But I don't know. I think on the whole, my take on this Snowden situation is just that, it was like an aside that he made, it seems like, in a larger speech that very few people likely watched in its entirety. And he's the, Zcash guy who leaked all these documents and now had to seek asylum in Russia because he's like, has these very strong priors about privacy and what governments like can or may do. And so, he's going to be not the type of, like, ideologically, of course, he's going to split from Solana because Solana has more of a pragmatic bent. It has token extensions that allow for permanent delegate authority where you can like freeze tokens, essentially. That's something I can't see Snowden being interested in, but like, of course he's not. And I don't know.
One thing that's worth adding as well is like Zuko, who's the actual creator of Zcash, who I'm pretty good friends with, actually. We talk quite frequently. He's also good friends with Anatoly. He would not consider Solana centralized. Like, there's no way. Just if you ever actually talk to him. And like, Zcash is technically more centralized than Solana on a relative basis, like just by node counts and kind of the design. That's not to say Zcash is centralized, though, because it's not. In fact, I use it. And I wouldn't use it if I thought it could fail in some centralized fashion. And so, like, Snowden, one of the things that also bothers me about this whole thing is like, people kind of just take Snowden's word for it because he's now this huge figure that is famous for like leaking these documents and stuff. And like, I don't have any opinions on that, but like, this does not make him an authority on the Solana network and how the nodes and the data and all that. Like, he hasn't done the work to have an opinion there, which is, it's kind of like this thing where like actors start weighing in on politics or something, where it's like, okay, yeah, like you have a platform and so you can say things and people will believe you, but have you actually done the work here to understand what's happening? Which is why I said, hey, let's debate. Show me the data. I'll glad to be proven wrong if you can show me it. I'd be very surprised if I missed something in all these years, but just put it to the test.
Well, I think we've covered the Ed issue pretty well, but yeah, it's been like a weird. There was also this Sriram stuff that we won't get into, but it seems like it was a big week for Sol versus ETH / other ecosystems debates.
We should get into that. I thought that was interesting. I believe it was in response to like Kyle. Oh no, okay. I think basically here's what happened. I think David from Bankless tweeted something about like, decentralizing later or something is like not the way or something like that. Like, it was something along those lines. And Kyle Samani was like, that's all L2s. And he's of course correct. And then Sriram and then I believe David responded back with like, Solana is not really doing DeFi, which seems weird to me because it's okay. And then I think Kyle responded with something like, real-time price discovery or something for DeFi is like the ideal playground, which is akin to what generally Toly says about like a state machine being ideal for DeFi. And then I think Sriram co-tweeted that and said three things. He said something like, it will never be NASDAQ. Something about it will never be like programmable compute. And I think something about verification.
It won't be as verifiable as Bitcoin was the third.
Yes, I think like those were the three. You can check me on that if I'm incorrect. But I responded. And it's just like people are kind of just talking over each other as opposed to tackling any coherent points. Like, NASDAQ is just a slogan. Like the actual goal isn't to replace or isn't to be as performant as NASDAQ. It's just to be the most performant L1. Now, if that actually ends up becoming a competitor to NASDAQ, great. But like Solana will never be faster than NASDAQ, therefore it's bad is like a really weird thing as a slogan. It's like saying, like, I think Eigenlayers was like build anything. And it's like so like you want me to just go ahead and say, okay, well, people haven't built absolutely everything possible here, therefore you can't build anything, therefore Eigenlayer sucks. Like that's just not a way of thinking that's realistic.
Do you have thoughts on Tolly's whole thing about like if a news event happens in Singapore and you have multiple concurrent proposers, but there's one in Singapore, it's like faster than NASDAQ essentially?
I am not fully convinced of that. I also haven't dug deep into all the mechanism designed there to really weigh in. I think some people agree with this, some people don't. So I'm not fully convinced, but I do think it's still a good design in some cases. And the second thing he said was like, it won't be like programmable compute or something like that, which that is just a weird thing to say because it's just an L1. Just like any other L1 that's Turing complete, you write some code, you deploy it on the smart contracts, and it does the state transitions. All blockchains are the same in this way, except for Bitcoin and whatever is not Turing complete. So that actually makes no sense. Maybe that's just like a weird semantics thing that he's trying to do there, but it's not correct. And the third is the verifiability thing, which is that it'll never be as verifiable as Bitcoin. And it's like that's probably correct. But that's not to say it won't be verifiable. I was just talking about Mithril, which is a home verification client. And so that like it's I can kind of see what he's trying to get at, but then he presents Eigenlayer as the antidote to all these things, but then only lists out the good parts of Eigenlayer and then does not cover any downsides of Eigenlayer in any way. And so it's like, here's why your solution is awful in every way, and then here's why my solution is great in every way. And then I think actually Mustafa called him out, who's the founder of Celestia, a few days later. He said he got sick of like Eigen people reply guying all Celestia posts or something. Maybe he said like, yeah, well, you don't have this, you don't have that, you don't have this, you don't have this, etc. And then he kind of like picked it apart. And he knows this much better than I do. And then that was also followed by like Sriram comparing Arbitrum's latency to Solana's latency. I think he said something like, well, Arbitrum is already lower latency than Solana. And of course, that's just a category error. Like it's an L2, obviously. It's not an L1. And then I replied with saying, well, actually, if you wanted the exact same behavior on Solana, you would look at the similar comparison, which is something like getCode, which is a state channel or like quasi L2. And it also gives you instant confirmations, right? So like you can't, and this led to another tweet, I think maybe the day after by me, which is like, people are starting to compare Solana to entire architectures consisting of L1s, L2s, and DA layers. And it's like, I understand why they're doing that because that's like the only way they can kind of get close to the properties of Solana. But that's a false comparison because Solana is just an L1. You can also build L2s or other sorts of layers on top of it to, arrive at the characteristics you're looking to arrive at. And so just a lot of nuance gets missed here. And so just wanted to give my 2 cents.
The Sei network brought parallel execution to the EVM with their V2 update this past spring. Sub-second finality and massive throughput are now available to EVM developers everywhere on Sei's high-performance Layer 1. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. That's dragonswap.app. Thanks again to Sei for sponsoring today's episode.
It's been a lot to keep up with. I think, too, it's been interesting seeing like a lot of the kind of the mega ETHs or the monads of the world joining the kind of like collective debate that maybe kicked off after Breakpoint. And I think one of the powder kegs for that, with arguments about how performant Solana is relative to L2s or maybe relative to some of the alt L1s that are in production, was the announcement of Firedancer, which I want to get into with you because Firedancer, I think, was maybe the most important thing to be announced at Breakpoint. I can't think of a more like consequential one, at least for Solana. The Seeker was obviously interesting, but Firedancer is this independently developed validator client by Jump. It's written in C rather than Rust. And so kind of the idea, as you alluded to earlier, Mert, but once that comes online, it really takes out like a liveness risk that Solana would have, where even if something, catastrophic happens with the Anza and Jito version of the Solana client, you can keep the network running via Firedancer. Currently, the Frankendancer is online, to my understanding, in non-voting mode. So it's sort of a half Firedancer, half Anza client, and then the full hog, the full Firedancer is live on testnet, which is all an update.
So Frankendancer is live on mainnet in full. Firedancer is also live on mainnet, but in non-voting mode.
Okay. So like we can get into lots of stuff here. One place that I wanted to start, Mert, that I thought was interesting was something you talked about. I don't think I saw other people talking about, is that Firedancer is introducing a new fiber layer for the internet, as like in addition to just building a validator client. I wanted to just unpack with you what that means.
So yeah, it's not Firedancer. It's a different team that might work with Firedancer and probably will. And there's not too much information on this. It's relatively, I don't want to say confidential, but certainly not publicized very much. It was on the demo days. But basically, one of the things you start to realize as you build these systems, like super high performance blockchains, let's say, is that at some point the internet becomes a bottleneck. And what I mean by that is, so for example, if somebody in Brazil sends like a transaction or a packet, let's say, to somebody in Tokyo, if you look at a map, you would imagine that just goes straight to Brazil or something. Like that'd be the shortest path, it'd be very quick. But actually what happens, due to the incentives of internet service providers, which is actually not to improve the speeds of the internet. This is a bizarre concept, but what ends up happening is that actually it goes from Brazil all the way to the eastern end of the United States. And then it zigzags its way through the United States through all these random paths, goes to like outside of Japan, and then goes through some other places and then lands in Tokyo. And it's just like a super inefficient route. And so this team is basically saying like, okay, we should just they already have a network. The team behind it has already actually set up fiber networks for Web 2 or general internet stuff and telecom networks. So they're a very, very good team. And they're basically saying, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to actually improve some of these fiber networks themselves, either by laying better fiber or more efficient fiber, or by incentivizing people to provide bandwidth, like more efficient bandwidth. And they also have some other things, like they have a new hardware component that you can add to some of these data center networks that will actually do some Solana specific stuff like deduping transactions, because if there's spam and it's thousands of the same transaction, this will actually dedupe it before it even gets to the validator, or like verifying signatures, which is like an expensive task. So it can do all these kinds of things. So it's like a more programmable but also faster internet. And it's unclear exactly what the details will look like, but I chatted with this team quite a bit, and it's probably the most impressive project I've seen in crypto. And it's also not even specific to crypto, like people without, it's you can maybe liken it to Helium, which is like, yeah, it uses crypto to provide like mobile coverage, but it's not specific to crypto people. Like people in Miami can just use this, even if they have nothing to do with crypto. It's kind of the same idea here. Because like these quants, like, the HFT firms of the world, they don't really use the regular internet. They use very hyper optimized fiber networks so that they are actually landing these trades and capturing market arbitrages and all this stuff. So I think this is actually the most impressive project in crypto that I've seen. Maybe more than Firedancer even, because I think the scope is much bigger. But like they're both very cool.
Something I've never seen a good answer for that I'm curious about is, what is the business case for Jump Crypto to build Firedancer in the first place? Like, it seems like a huge amount of engineering resources. I don't know about huge. I don't know how many people there are working on it, but Like, why does it benefit Jump, which is like an HFT trading firm, to my understanding, from a business perspective, to put this much time to develop Firedancer?
I think there's a few things for it. So there's quite a few teams that spin out of Jump, so like Pith or Wormhole, and like Jump actually, like, obviously is an investor in those companies. And so getting those companies to perform better is going to be just better for their investments. And Jump also has other crypto investments. They also did receive, I believe, a pretty large grant for doing this work. But then also, I think there's, if you have the thesis that, let's say, HFT or global finance will come on chain, you want to be the one pioneering that, so you can understand it. You can have the in-house expertise of how these systems work, and some skin in the game and all this, such that if this transition does happen, then you are the market leader, right? So it's also kind of like more of an R&D effort. I mean, I'm speculating here. Obviously, I'm not the founder of Jump or the project leads. I don't know exactly. People do also have like some weird conspiracy theories around this, which is around like MEV or something. But that's actually totally midwit. Like, that's a super stupid take, because Jump is one of the most regulated entities on Earth, because they don't just do crypto; they do all markets, including everything that the SEC has a hand on. But like rubber, anything, any market you can think of, Jump's probably in it trading, and so they're super regulated. And so if they were to do some illegal stuff, which some jurisdictions consider illegal, like MEV, they would instantly get destroyed. And because they really need the SEC to work with them for all these other markets, which are the majority of their business. And so I think like it's actually just a very simple R&D model, where if finance is going to become on chain, then they should be leading the way. And then obviously venture investments, as well as grant, as well as like there's other teams that could come out of Jump, that they could incubate, etc. And so it's just to be like that, the leader of technology. I have met the founder. He's also like a super libertarian type. Like, he generally believes in crypto, and really believes in the ideals. And so I think there's, if I just speaking as a founder, there's probably some of that as well, because like it's not like he needs the money. Extremely rich, obviously. And so at some point it also becomes more purpose driven, which is like, we just think finance would function better on chain versus like this weird political structure that exists today. So that's my speculation.
Another thing I've been interested to chat with you about is, 1 million transactions per second gets thrown out there a lot in regards to Firedancer. I think because it's a sexy like whole number to think about. In reality, who knows like what the TPS that Firedancer will hit will be. But I guess just like from a pragmatic level, like Solana non-vote uses, I think, between 500 and 1,000 TPS most times. With vote transactions, it's like 3,000 maybe. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it's in the order of like a couple of thousand. So even if Firedancer scales to 100,000 TPS, that's like far beyond the demand for block space right now, right? So is the idea that you're sort of building Firedancer, and then in the future, as more value comes on chain, you'll just be able to meet the demand for all of those, like all of that block space with transactions per second? Or how much does like the increase in TPS actually matter right now? I guess I should ask.
Yeah, it's actually, if you look at Kevin Bowers' Breakpoint talk about Firedancer, he actually kind of mentions this, which is I think he gives the analogy of like a sports car and like a very busy highway. And it's like, it can go really fast, but at some point it becomes a function of demand versus where you actually need people to utilize this block space and perhaps use the right tooling to. So here's an example. The way Solana blocks get filled is via something called compute units. So like if I send you a transfer right now, that'll be like a very small amount of compute units. But if I do like a swap involving like 18 markets or something, that'll be a higher number. And so those transactions are not equal, but they're in a TPS setting, they're considered equal. because they're a transaction. And so there's a factor to this where what you need to actually start doing is reducing the compute units consumed by the programs or the transactions. And so TPS can go up that way as well. So for example, Solana generally hovers around something like 700 non-vote TPS, but that's just the average. During different compositions of compute units, it's actually broken 3,000 non-vote TPS, right? And that is to say, TPS is a function of demand, compute units, and then obviously block space, but it's not determined entirely by one of those things. I think there's like the concept of like induced demand, which is, okay, now that there is much more space and people can play around more, maybe they'll just start putting more stuff on chain that they couldn't before. Now, will they have a reason to? It's unclear, but I think the interesting thing about these things is that they're like kind of creative endeavors, in that once the playground becomes more available, there is this expansion phase of like people noticing it and understanding it. There's like a lag, right? They're like, okay, well, actually I can do this now. And it doesn't stop me at 700 TPS. And so now you can start doing more and more activities. And like, this is also what some of these other like alt-al ones get wrong. And what they'll do is like they'll benchmark on mainnet with like a super highly controlled program or something. They'll be like, oh, we just broke the TPS record. We just did 5,000 TPS. But then once that goes away, the TPS is like 10, because it's a function of our developers actually using this block space. And so, yeah, I mean, the most fundamental thing is our developers using it, which comes back to my spiel, which I repeat frequently. It's like the only thing that actually matters here is the use case. Are going to be these use cases that actually leverage block space and actually give a shit about low latency and composability such that this is necessary? Okay, that's the most important question. The Firedancer thing is more like it's like a future-proofing the system, right? Which is to say that, okay, if something like this were to happen, can the network actually handle it elastically going forward, or will it just fucking totally break, which Solana has done in the past, such that this network is not viable for increased usage? So that's remains to be seen.
And there's this secondary vector of performance, which is latency, right? So, like, how quickly does the block get built and broadcast to the network? On Solana, that's 400 milliseconds, I believe, is the block time. But that's different from TPS. So do you think that latency needs to improve as well? And how does that happen separately from Firedancer?
Well, yeah, I mean, shorter block times are certainly preferable. And Totally wrote a blog post about Solana's endgame a while ago, in which he proposes that we should go down to roughly 120 millisecond block times, so roughly a 4x improvement in latency. And assuming you have multiple concurrent proposers all over the globe, then the user to the leader latency is actually much reduced, right? Because currently, here's a simple way to think about it. Imagine the globe. There's one leader at any given time, and no matter where you are in the world, you have to travel to that leader, your transactions do. But if you have multiple concurrent leaders, then the distance that your packets have to travel to the leader is much shorter, and so you get a better latency. And so latency is also a very big one. And in terms of how Firedancer aims to solve that, I haven't seen... Well, I mean, there's a few things, because like Firedancer is also doing other things like defining a formal spec. And once you have that, and once you've actually reworked the networking layer, you can start to understand where the bottlenecks are and kind of go from there. So engineering is a very iterative process, right? Like you didn't just get from the first Model T Ford to F1 cars. It kind of needs to play that out, which I think Solana excels at, which is the iterative engineering model, sometimes to its detriment. But generally, over a long time period, that's how engineering works, and it's always how it's worked.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe the final thing to pick your brain on is like, say Firedancer comes on like fully on mainnet with participating in consensus and these types of things. Does that look different from a consumer point of view? Like, would me doing my swap on Jupiter notice a difference once there's a full Firedancer node? Or is it more something that's going to be fully in the back end?
So this would depend pretty heavily on that lag phase that I mentioned, which is it won't happen instantly because, first of all, a certain percent of the network has to upgrade to it. A certain percent of the stake has to upgrade to it. And then you need to identify, okay, well, are we going to run both these clients on mainnet, or are we going to run one main one and then one primary fallback one? And once you start doing that, then you need to look at Jupyter's developers, for example. Are they going to actually try to optimize for Firedancer's new software? And they probably will, but it's like, when will they do that? Generally, with infrastructure, what you want is you want to optimize for being boring. Meaning, we are talking right now, and we're not commenting on the internet speed because the internet speed just works. And that's how it should be. It should be the same with Firedancer, meaning that once it's like live and everything is like upgraded properly, you should just never really comment on Solana's network because it should just be in the background. It should just be boring. Your transactions shouldn't fail. You shouldn't have a reason to have any failures. You shouldn't have any technical issues or anything like that. And then you just want to get to a state where the only thing that matters are the quality of the apps on top of the network. And so I think that'll be, and then, there's also some component to this, which is it'll help application developers actually focus more on their apps and hence build better apps because they won't have to worry about the weird technical issues that they might have seen from Solana in the past. So, but again, the important thing to understand there is that can't, by definition, be an overnight thing. There's this lag phase where people actually have to upgrade, and this needs to propagate for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the point there, especially about use cases, because I think that Firedancer has long been talked about in this kind of mythical way with people I'll talk to in Solana, where it's like, well, man, like once Firedancer comes online, like that's going to be super bullish for the SOL price. Usually is the context, and I think that there's a question of like, okay, you can build this thing, but now, like, what's the point? Like, great, you can do 1 million TPS, but is the block space going to fill? But it's really cool to see Firedancer come along because it's been talked about in a very abstract way for some time, but now, with some of this stuff getting into the wild, I'm just excited to see kind of what becomes of it.
I would also say from a competitive point of view is something that investors look at, which is to say that the thesis before, which I think is false, is that, okay, like a single L1 cannot scale to anything significant in terms of scale, right? They'll say something like, well, Solana does 2K TPS, but then like L2s, if you just add a bunch of them or something, can do more TPS overall. But then now if Firedancer can do 1 million TPS, then it starts to bring in the question, why are all these other scaling solutions necessary? Are they actually going to be a 10x improvement over Solana, even a 2x, or even any improvement at all? And then this also comes back to me shilling myself, which is my argument's always been the use case, right? Perhaps 1 million TPS is useless for you because you have a custom need for sovereign block space, right? Maybe you're like a small game and it's like, I don't give a shit if there's a global state machine here. I just want to build a small little game and it just needs to talk to a small rollup and that's it. And that's what actually matters, because the thesis that like a single L1 cannot scale will be proven wrong. Just that's not even like a strong claim because it's just kind of basic physics. Like these things will start improving more and more. And what you're basically saying is there'll be so much more demand that a single L1 doing 1 million TPS will not be able to handle it. But then I'm not sure how you can make that claim if you look at production today. And I think the entirety of L2s combined is still below 1,000 TPS. So it's like, where will this demand come from exactly? And which is the use cases. And so what you should be focusing on are the use cases. And then once you focus on the use case, then you can ask, okay, does this suit an L1 or does it suit a custom block space like an app chain or an L2? right? That's fundamentally what matters, working backwards from the use case.
Yes. Yeah. And always having the use case as the North Star is good, I think. I think one of my complaints recently has been crypto feels a little less interested in explaining itself sometimes because it can get very inside baseball, but always thinking like, okay, at some level, this is a thing that people or entities use, needs to be the guiding light for blockchains. Okay. Another one that I threw on here that's a little out of left field, Mert, is that CZ got out of prison this week. Throwing up our fours for the Binance CEO. Obviously was indicted on charges related to sort of Binance's operations in the U.S. We're not going to dive into all of that, but he got out of prison. He's able to eat more than one piece of fruit a day now, and he's working on Giggle Academy, which is just an awesome name for his school initiative. And he's also writing a book and taking some time before doing other crypto stuff. Now, there's only so much you can say about CZ getting out of prison, but the reason I want to bring this up, Mert, is it got me thinking about what we used to call kind of crypto's main character syndrome. So I remember in like November of 2022, I was an intern at Blockworks, and the bear market turned one. It was like 1 year since the prices all peaked in November 2021, and I kind of wrote about all of the main characters that had come to define crypto: Do Kwon, SBF, CZ. I'm sure there's others that are slipping my mind right now. Brian Armstrong has never really been that, but I guess you could throw him in that category. And that was always one of the fun things about covering crypto, is it was this sector that's run by these like 29-year-old wonderkins who have really like crazy personalities and are tweeting all the time. As I look around now, it's hard to actually point out who the main characters are. And so as the number one KOL, Mert, I wanted to ask you, like, has crypto gotten over this main character syndrome, or are we in between the identification of main characters? Like, what's kind of your thought there?
I don't think it's gotten over them, because I don't think it's a crypto specific thing. I think it's just a human condition thing. You can just look at outside of crypto. There's obviously Elon, Palmer Luckey, Steve Jobs, Zuck. I mean, Zuck is really doing a moment right now, right?
Yeah.
The founder of like Salesforce, like Mark Benioff, Larry Ellison, people. Or you can actually take it to other levels and go to countries like Lee Kuan Yew or something from Singapore, Trump, obviously, Putin, Erdogan. Like this, it's just people like symbols for things, and it's a very simplified way of thinking about it. Like, hey, this person represents all of this, and so it's like a good meme or compression way of communicating ideas. Obviously, it's not perfect and generally messes up a lot, but I don't think it ever goes away, like ever, because it hasn't. This is one of the few things that's actually Lindy in the world. Looking up to kind of these leaders has been a thing since day one of Earth, really, or civilization, let's say, not Earth. Right, all the way from Hammurabi and whatnot. In crypto, I guess maybe your point is more around the relative decline of frequency of these main characters. I think that's probably correct in some sense, but I think they still exist. So, like, obviously, Tolly is one, Sriram is one, Jesse from Base is probably one, and the founders of like Barrel, like Smokey and stuff, are some as well. I would say maybe even Polymarket's founder Shane could be one, because Polymarket's arguably the most interesting app actually on Earth right now, which is a wild thing to say because it's crypto. You don't even really know if it's crypto, but it's past like the New York Times or something, I believe, like for like the third like political app or something. That's pretty crazy, and I don't think it goes away. I think if I were to really try to create something here, what's happening is there's probably more diversification, meaning there's all these different solutions now. There's all different L1s, all different L2s, all different DeFi apps. There's like Hyperliquid. And so now it's just like there's more and more people such that it becomes difficult for one person to stand out unless they're super insane. And then also like the figures generally have been like exchange operators, right? Like CZ, Sam, Brian, even Do Kwon to an extent, like they have to hold a very large amount of money for people to care what they think, in a sense, which is why traders are big on Twitter. Like Ansem obviously has a lot of money as well. And so that seems like you can't really take on Coinbase at this point unless you're like super focused on your go-to-market. Like for example, Backpack is going after Japan specifically. And so there's also the thing of like people actually understand the main character syndrome now, so they don't want to be the main character, right? Kind of going back to the Satoshi days, which is like Satoshi's like, fuck that. Like I do not reveal who I am because that brings no good. I would say Vitalik is still the main character as well. Like Vitalik will say anything and then people, literally anything, and people 5,000 likes instantly. Like he'll post like a 500-page blog post, but then 5,000 likes. Nobody's read it yet. And so I think crypto's probably gotten better at self-regulating a little bit, but I would expect one of these characters to pop back up pretty soon.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. Like in last cycle, it was maybe a little easier to just pull out like, okay, it's SBF versus CZ, East versus West. It just was a lot easier to pull out like who are the main characters in crypto. Today, it's just a little harder. And I think you can be the main character of like a niche subgenre in crypto. So like Ansem is the main character maybe of meme coin trading, or I don't know. Mert would be up there for, I guess, like infra and things like that. So maybe it's harder to just become like the crypto guy that everybody knows. I also think,
complex.
Yeah.
Like, the complexity of ecosystem as it grows just becomes more and more or increases more and more. And so I think the sub niche thing is like a good observation, which is say like, okay, now there's kind of the DA wars. It's like, okay, is it Celestia or is it Eigen DA or is it a Veil or is it fuck the DA? Do I just do everything in L1? And if I do that, maybe I'll listen to Toli. Or is it ZK? And then there's ZK guys. And it's just like all these different things. Or like, is it Cosmos? Or maybe it's Barachain, and maybe it's Noble. Is it stable coins? Is it USDC or USDT? And so as everything kind of keeps growing, and this is just capitalism, competition increases. And as competition increases, it doesn't just become about Michael Jordan anymore. It becomes about Michael Jordan versus the Celtics or versus the Lakers. And maybe it's about Magic Johnson. It just keeps getting more and more complex.
Interesting. Yeah. So, okay, I think with our last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to like touch on the general, we haven't really talked since Breakpoint, but you were there, I guess, for Token and for Breakpoint in Singapore. The whole crypto world was pretty focused on that for that week. There were a lot of announcements that came out, and it just seemed like tons and tons of folks descended on Singapore. So I don't know, I guess we're 2 weeks post Singapore now. What are your general takeaways or like feelings about the crypto world? Can be confined to Solana or more broadly, just post that sort of conference season out there?
Yeah, so I actually went to basically all the conferences this year. I had like a strict rule to not do conferences for the first 2 years of Helios, and then this year I was kind of like, let me just kind of see what I'm missing out here. So I've been on this circuit for like 4 or 5 months almost. So I went to like ECC, Korea Blockchain Week, etc. I'm going to like Cosmoverse, and with Breakpoint specifically, one thing I would comment on is how much larger it was than all the other breakpoints. There's just a lot more people, and these people were generally like, people would say like it's like about meme coins or something, but like I did not see much meme coin activity in person. It was a lot of teams that were building things, even phones or like hardware devices. There was side events that were like super focused on a vertical, like DeFi Day or MEV Day. or Validator Day. And the communities are just much larger in size. And like me and Tolly were doing a fireside chat, and like that was a huge room and it was packed. It was thousands of people. And I was like, that's like pretty insane that people are just watching us two talk here, or like Kevin Bowers' talk. The debates were pretty cool. People were like debating for their positions, but also stealing the other people's positions and stuff. So I think like conferences are almost can be treated like a product in which they kind of just keep getting better over time as you learn what sucks from the past ones. The main thing that I'll comment on, which probably everybody knows, is like the biggest difference that I saw was the focus on products on Solana versus the focus on infra on other networks in terms of the conference. Like you would go to, I went to a bunch of talks at ECC and they were almost all infra focused. And I actually mean that. Like you can kind of just look at the agenda and very niche infra focused too. Versus on Solana, it was like 5-minute product keynotes and just pumping out product after product, whether it's like a new debit card, Franklin Templeton putting a mutual fund on chain, a new phone, because there was actually other phones other than Solana Seeker, or like prediction markets, all this stuff. And it was just very product focused. So that was the biggest difference. So just size and the segment of focus.
We talked about, I guess, Firedancer and how decentralized Solana is, but there were like lots and lots of things at Breakpoint to separate the signal from the noise. What's something non-Firedancer, I guess I'll say, that you're interested or excited by coming out of that time in Singapore?
I think the number of new startups was really cool to see. Like a lot of people have ideas and some sort of an MVP, and they're just looking to get some help from the ecosystem to, go to market and stuff. So the number of those folks that were actually like good products was pretty inspiring. And then two is we always talk about DePin, but it seems to just keep getting bigger and bigger. Like there's a few pretty big DePin projects, like a new energy grid, new CDN network. Renner completed their migration. HiMapper keeps getting bigger. Helium keeps getting bigger. And the DePin, and then like the internet fiber network is perhaps the biggest one. That's basically a DePin network. And so that is, I think, crypto's biggest chance to really make an impact outside of this circular economy and actually help people in areas where they would be excluded from crypto, or let's say better products. Like Google Maps in certain areas of the world just sucks. I mean, actually, Korea blockchain, Google Maps doesn't work, by the way, right? In South Korea, Google is blocked. Google Maps is blocked. And so if you have peer-to-peer mapping with something like HiMapper, that's genuinely just a better experience for the citizens of that country. That's pretty big. And so I think there's a lot of those left because there's a lot of physical stuff that's been neglected in the world of venture capital due to just generally shittier businesses, right? Like lower margins, harder entrepreneurs, worse competition, taking on monopolies. But if crypto is this thing that's actually supposed to help the world, and it does that through better networks because blockchain is just networks, then physical networks are probably the most interesting ones to tackle. And I'm seeing a good rise in those.
That's all the time that we have for today. But it's interesting to get that little aside on Singapore before we end. Conference season also is not over. We have permissionless coming next week, and there's going to be a live Lightspeed taping. So if you have not signed up yet, what are you doing? You need to sign up. Use Lightspeed 10 at checkout to get 10% off. I'd love to meet some of you in person. But besides that, that is all we have for our roundup today. Mert, it's been good getting behind the mic with you again. Thank you as always, and we'll see you all next week.
This episode would not have been possible without the Sei network. Don't forget, user incentives are coming to Sei from teams like DragonSwap. Make sure to check out Sei today. You can start farming on Sei by visiting dragonswap.app.